So now let's talk about the past year and a half. Obviously, we've seen inflation, and at one point in the summer of last year, we saw inflation hit a 40-year high. So then flat coins were introduced to keep up with this inflation, but that
Mhm.
sounds almost too good to be true. Sorry, I sound like a skeptic, but is it
Mhm.
too good to be true?
Right, and that kind of flat coins in many ways go back to sort of the initial promise of crypto. I mean, Bitcoin was created 15 years ago as sort of a protest to, uh, I guess, the largesse, or and I guess some people will call it fraud, or just the poor risk management that precipitated the 2008 great financial crisis. And then in addition, the um the vast monetary stimulus that sort of led us out of it to what was a decade of, or decade plus, of prosperity until the coronavirus crisis hit again. Stablecoins sort of helped limit price volatility, but they were not immune to inflation, which, as you just mentioned, Brittany, is still at the highest that it has been in decades. And sort of flat coins were meant as a way to sort of harken back to, I guess, in some ways, that early crypto ethos, which was to sort of be immune to inflation. Inflation can sometimes be a political boogeyman. It can be sort of a trigger word for some people, especially in crypto, because they see inflation as sort of the Fed and its counterparts around the world arbitrarily printing billions and trillions of dollars in an effort to prop up governments and do all types of things that the most Puritan crypto believers believe to be immoral or illegal, depending on how they see it. Inflation is not necessarily a bad thing, but inflation needs to be held into account and or held in check. And in circumstances like this, where inflation has gone up, in some cases earlier this year or late last year, 10% year on year, uh, everybody who takes a salary, everybody that holds dollars in a bank account, was basically seeing the value of those holdings evaporate into the ether. No pun intended. So flat coins were really seen as a way to try to help create a stable coin that's not necessarily stable to the price of the US dollar, the world's global reserve currency, but stable to a particular standard of living, which in this case, or in the case of the projects that I detailed in my report, really focus on the CPI, which is released by the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, or in one particular case, sort of a bespoke Moneyball-esque approach to creating what one firm sees as a more accurate indicator of inflation.
When you wrote about this for Forbes, you described the basic mechanics of flat coins as complicated and risky. Why?
Mhm.
What's the risk here? Because when you say something like immune to inflation, that sounds great, especially in this economic climate. But
Mhm.
what's the risk?
Right. So there is always risk when you are trying to generate additional yield for tokens. And despite all the marketing terminology and jargon that is being promoted by what I believe to be well-meaning, well-intentioned entrepreneurs that are trying to solve a problem that is worth addressing, something has to happen in the back end to generate those additional returns. If inflation is up 6% or 7% or 9% or 10%, something has to happen behind the curtain to create those additional returns that then can be passed on to the user. So what typically ends up happening is that the collateral that is given to these platforms is then essentially invested in, or deposited at decentralized finance, what's known as DeFi lending protocols and decentralized exchanges, where those assets are essentially used to help provide liquidity to that multi-billion dollar industry. And then the returns accrued from essentially the returns accrued from lending out those assets go back to the initial minters of those flat coins. So each different project has some unique permutations. Some are more complex than others, but at a very basic level, that's how those work. And I think it's important, and that's what we tried to illuminate in the report. It's important for purchasers of these tokens to understand that while these programs may try to invest assets or place assets in more mature DeFi protocols and try to help ensure or minimize the risk associated with participating in DeFi, there are real risks, and DeFi protocols have been hacked. They have been manipulated, that have led to hundreds of millions of dollars in losses for investors. And uh, in some ways, to me, it seems a little curious to do this, especially if the return in some cases is just designed to mimic inflation, which, despite still being at record high levels, is going down. I actually spoke to an economist at the American Institute for Economic Research who had studied some of these flat coins a few months ago. And I mean, one of the things that he mentioned to me is that this may have been even more compelling when inflation was 9 or 10% year on year, but now that it's, I think, under 5%, we're going to get a new inflation print tomorrow. We're hoping that it's going to go down even further. What is the real yield? What is the real return here? So there is a considerable amount of risk associated with these tokens for returns that hopefully are going to be going down as inflation recedes.